I'm fantastic at worrying. And being fantastic at worrying means that I am really good at getting into my own head and turning nothing into something. Whenever I would start to worry growing up, I found this method that would help me control it, although admittedly, it wasn't very healthy. The cycle would go something like this. Something would happen to me, I would start to freak out and get upset, but I wouldn't address it, because addressing it just made me feel worse about myself. So, instead, I would push it aside because I hated how my internal panic would make me feel. I was so good at internalizing my intrusive thoughts that I didn't even consider that my anxiety might be a problem. I mean, everyone gets anxious, right? At the time, I didn't realize that having common worries about stuff like flying in a plane or public speaking is a lot different than having an anxiety disorder. When you have an anxiety disorder, worrying can control and consume your life. Your anxiety can manifest into, you can see the anxiety coming out right now. You can see the anxiety manifesting into an overwhelming state of panic that can prevent you from enjoying life and doing everyday activities. I began to realize my relationship with anxiety started to change when I started college. Going to college can be a really exciting time, especially when you're an 18-year-old. You're fresh out of high school, you're finally an adult, and you feel like you're on top of the world because you get to be on your own for the first time. You get to start figuring out who you are and who you want to be. There's new experiences and opportunities all around you, and as exciting as it is also completely and utterly terrifying. During my freshman year, I noticed that my worrying was becoming more and more common. Suddenly the stakes seemed higher than ever, and I couldn't stop worrying about everything. I would think and think and think until suddenly I was focusing on another problem, and then another worry, and then another fear. By the time I would finally be able to calm myself down, I wouldn't even be able to remember what I was initially worrying about. It was then when I began to realize that my old method of storing away my worries wasn't working as well as it used to. As my sophomore year started, my worrying only got worse, and my anxiety began to seep into my everyday routine. I would wake up in the middle of the night with feelings of dread. I've always been a sensitive person, but being able to control my emotions was becoming more and more of a difficult task. There would be days when I would struggle to eat because my stomach wouldn't stop turning. I looked at my anxiety as a burden on my life. During this period of my life, I couldn't tell you how many times I thought to myself, why can't I just stop caring? It was during this time when I was able to start restoring my thoughts as a self-defense mechanism. I knew keeping my worries bottled up wasn't a good idea, but it provided me a sense of temporary relief and comfort for at least a little while. This was working out for a while, but then I had my first anxiety attack, and I remember it vividly. I was sitting in my bed late at night, trying to block out my intrusive thoughts. It wasn't working, and I started to panic. Like I'm panicking right now.
You're doing so good.
Oh, thank you.
You're good, Hannah. Take your time.
I know, Jordan. Thank you. Jordan's the best hype man in the story. We got it now. I'm back on track. My heart began to pound, and my mind was racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And before I knew it, I couldn't breathe, and I started to hyperventilate. Luckily, the rational side of me realized that something was wrong, and after about 10 seconds of trying to calm myself down, what felt like the longest 10 seconds of my life, I was finally able to breathe again. It was during this time, after this anxiety attack, when I realized that my anxiety was becoming too much for me to handle on my own. I was exhausted, and I realized that I couldn't keep living life like this. It was then when I started to consider that maybe seeking professional help wasn't a bad idea. And during this process, I found out something about seeking help. It's one thing to actually admit you have a problem. It's another thing to go out and actually get help for that problem. And that would be another obstacle I would have to conquer. I began to do research on different therapy options. And I began to do research to ignore it. My anxiety continued to fluctuate for months as I debated getting help. And then, finally, one night, after a series of bad days and thought spirals, I had another anxiety attack. And finally, after the second anxiety attack, that night I finally decided to reach out to an office for counseling. A few weeks later, I found myself sitting in my very first therapy session. My therapist at the time started to ask me questions, and I began to pour my heart out to her about how I'd been feeling for the past year. I explained how much I hated the way I was feeling, and how much I felt my anxiety was hindering my life, how much I wanted all of my worries to stop for good. It was then when my therapist told me something that truly changed my perspective on my relationship with my anxiety. She looked at me and said, "Hannah, your anxiety is part of who you are. You can't get rid of it, but you can find ways to manage it so that it doesn't control your life. Your anxiety can be an asset. You can learn how to accept it." After this session, I could not stop thinking about this. I mean, the thought of embracing my mental illness seemed ridiculous. It took me a while to figure out what this meant, but eventually, everything started to clear, and I could see the bigger picture. I didn't have to let my anxiety manage my life. I could acknowledge it, accept it, and move forward. Instead of trying to deny it, I could embrace it as a part of who I am, and realizing this was extremely freeing. Being able to learn about my anxiety and accept it as part of who I am has allowed me to accept it in ways I never thought I could before. I can struggle with my mental health and still have a successful and fulfilling life. I can still find ways to be happy and find peace within myself. I understand now that it's a part of how I think. I still consider myself to be a fantastic worrier. I'm not saying that this is a way to completely get rid of your anxiety. My anxiety hasn't been cured, and it never will be. I'm stuck with it, but I don't have to let it make me miserable. Now, when I start to slip, I try not to let myself completely crash. Because I've learned to accept and embrace my anxiety disorder, it doesn't bother me as much as it once did. And now I know it can't prevent me from living the life